And I'm speaking to you from ICPSR at the University of Michigan, where I'm a research scientist. This is a webinar series offered by iAssist. And for those of you who are new to iAssist, you would probably want to know that we are an international organization of professionals working with information technology and data services to support research and teaching, to help benefit all data professionals and to support research data and open scientists. iAssist offers webinars like today's to support the professional development needs of our members. With this, I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. William O'Hare. Dr. O'Hare has used Census Bureau data for more than 50 years, primarily working for nonprofit organizations. Dr. O'Hare has been on Census Bureau advisory committees. He's been a consultant to the Census Bureau from 2011 to 2013. He was a research fellow at the Census Bureau, where he focused on high net undercount of young children. He has written 2 books on the quality of the US Census, including Differential Undercounts in the US Census, Who is Missed, and Undercount of Young Children in the US Decennial Census. So with this introduction, you know that you are in good hands for the next hour as we hear from Dr. O'Hare. Take it away.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the census, and I guess I should say good afternoon, good morning in the West Coast. Go to the next slide if you could, just to give you a brief overview. I plan to talk a little bit about how the 2020 census is conducted, and then talk about some of the key results of the 2020 census. Now, note right now that a lot of the details about the data from the census are not yet available. So this is kind of top line results. And then I'll end with measuring the quality of the census. When I was first approached to talk about this, that's what one thing was stressed. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And the last point here, just to make it clear, I'm going to oversimplify some of the points in this presentation to contain it to less than an hour. I expect it to be about 35 or 40 minutes. So, so that's the outline of where I had hoped to go. The next slide, please. So Amy made reference to this book that I wrote a couple of years ago. It came out in 2019. It's open access, which I guess you all know it means free. And it's got a lot of detail about some of the things I'm going to talk about today, and maybe a good reference, I guess, if you're looking for more detail or someone you're working with wants more detail about some of the topics talked about. This is certainly the cheapest way to get that. And I think it covers topics in a way that is not totally technical demographic, but tries to talk to a broader audience of stakeholders. So, so I say I'll leave this up for 1 second, but if you want to copy that down and Google it as Springer Publisher, it's available for free. Next slide. Let me say a word about the importance of the census. I know for people who don't follow the census, it's easy to overlook this civil institution, this government institution. I'll go back by pointing out that the census is mentioned in the 5th sentence of the US Constitution. And I remind myself from time to time what a unusual thing this was in 1780s when the founding fathers decided to apportion political power based on population. That was not a widespread idea in the 1780s. And I think it's worked relatively well for us, but it's kind of highlights how important the census is in our system of governance. And in terms of distributing political power, there's 2 terms I want to kind of talk about and just make distinct, I guess. Reapportionment is data for the census used for reapportionment. Reapportionment is how seats in Congress are assigned to states. Every state gets 1, and then the rest are assigned depending on the number of people counted in the census in each state. So that's reapportionment. Redistricting, which sounds very similar but isn't, is the process of using census data to carve out or draw up congressional, not only congressional districts, but state legislative and city council and so on, but draw up districts that are relatively equal in population size to meet the 1 person, 1 vote criteria. It's also used to enforce the Voting Rights Act. So the census data is used heavily. Actually, right now, most of the states are going through this process of redistricting. A second point to recognize, and I think this is one of the things that is not widely understood, is that the census data is used in a whole bunch of federal funding formulas, about 315 that we've been able to identify. And those 315 funding formulas distributed more than $1.5 trillion in FY16, I think it was. $1.5 trillion to states and localities. So states that don't, states and localities that don't get an accurate count and to get an undercount, they don't get their fair share of trillions of dollars or lots of dollars. So the use of census data for funding for a 10-year period from now through 2030 is another important use of census data. I just put decisions of government in the private sector, of course, it's a lot of decisions that use census data for various things. And you can imagine the private sector, if the census data show a place is losing population, they're not likely to invest. If it shows they're gaining population, they're more likely to invest in that area. So census data can be really important in determining private sector investments in local areas, especially. And then research. I know a lot of you work for colleges and universities, and you know that a lot of the people in those colleges and universities use census data for a variety of research purposes. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the 2020 census was conducted. And there's one could spend a long time doing this, but I'm going to try and be brief, but not overlook any important details. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of the extent and the complexity of the 2020 census, I'll note that it cost $15.8 billion over a 10-year period, but also note this is $3 billion less than what it would have cost to repeat the 2010 methodology in 2020. Just as a footnote, in 2011, Congress mandated the Census Bureau to take the 2020 census at the same actual cost as the 2010 census, which is about $13 billion. A couple of years ago, Congress and the administration realized there wasn't enough money, so they increased it a little bit. But nonetheless, the amount of money in 2020 was quite a bit less than it would have taken to repeat the 2010 method. We're talking about 150 or so million housing units, places where people can live. These are really calling maybe addresses is the same thing as housing units here. Not all of them are occupied, but there's 150 million that the Bureau has to go to see if they're occupied or not. They hired more than 500,000 temporary workers. They took applications for more like 3 million. As you can imagine, a lot of people who applied don't show up, and some of those who show up don't last very long. So it's important to recruit a lot more people than you're going to need. And you can easily imagine in the summer of 2020, with COVID a rampage, a lot of the workers who might have applied didn't show up or didn't want to work where they were supposed to work. So, so that was a big undertaking and a difficult undertaking. The Census Bureau's likes to say that they're the largest mobilization outside of wartime. As far as I could tell, that's true. And a statistics I heard the other day from the Census Bureau is that the census ultimately will produce 15 trillion statistics. And so that's a lot of data. And you can see not only the complexity of collecting the data, but analyzing it and reporting it are also major undertakings. So let's go to the next slide. I want to emphasize that the decennial census is most important because it provides data for smaller areas. There's already a lot of data at the national level and for most states and even big cities and metropolitan areas. But a lot of these groups that are listed here, areas that are listed here, sometimes the only data they get over a decade is from the census. And for a lot of them, it's vital data that they can't get anywhere else. And so keep in mind that what's really important about the census and the census data is the data that are provided for relatively small geographic areas across the country, like the ones listed here and others. Next slide. There we go. So questions are asked in the decennial census, and here are the ones that are asked in the 2020 census. Age is pretty obvious, sex, it's male and female. I'm going to talk a little more detail about race and ethnicity, but just note that there are two different concepts in the census and in the federal statistical system. The other thing that's gathered in the census is called relationship to householder. Let me spend a minute on this. So when someone gets a census form to fill out, they're asked to name one person in the household as the householder. And they usually advise someone who's a co-owner of the house or renter's names on the rent. And it's almost always an adult. And so someone is put in as the householder, then all the other people in the household are identified in terms of their relationship to that householder, like spouse or child or grandparent and so on. So that's how the Census Bureau gets relationships to the householder. And then finally, the last thing it's asked is housing tenure, which means is this place rented or owned. So those are the major variables that are collected in the decennial census data. Just as a point, the Census Bureau used to collect a lot more detailed data like income and poverty and employment up until the 2000 census, and then they switched to this kind of short form census in 2010. So let me move on to talk a little bit, next slide, please, talk about race and ethnicity, because this is a concept that is not intuitive to a lot of people. And it's, and I should say again, it's not the Census Bureau's decision to make up these categories. It's required by the US Office of Management Budget, OMB. So on the far left-hand side, where you see figure 1 and question 6 in the census form, it asks everybody whether they are a person of Hispanic or Latino or Spanish origin. And the first box says, no, I'm not of that group. And then there's some detailed and then a place to write in alternatives. So this question basically sorts everybody into Hispanic or not Hispanic. And that's often referred to as ethnicity in Census Bureau OMB speak. I'm really always frustrated they don't just call it Hispanic origin, because that's what it is. But anyway, Hispanic origin or ethnicity is what's gotten from question 6. Then after everybody answers question 6, they go on to question 7, which asks, what's this person race? And you can see the choices down there and check box or write in alternatives if they want to. And basically there's it's actually 6 categories: white, black, American Indian, Alaska Native. The first 6 or 7 boxes there below check boxes are Asians, but different groups. And then another group of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. And then far down is this thing called some other race. And one of the problems, I guess it's the way to phrase it, that occurs in this way of collecting data is that an awful lot of Hispanics in particular get to the race question and they don't see themselves in any of those categories that are offered. So they go down, they end up marking some other race. And the one implication of that is some other race in 2020 was the second largest race category. There were more people who marked some other race than any other group except white. So it really complicates understanding kind of the racial distribution in the country and race and Hispanic distribution. And there's a kind of a political story behind this that I would get into if people are interested in the question and answer. So let me move on to the next slide and kind of talk about the implications of this way of collecting data. And I should emphasize that these are all self-identification. The Census Bureau doesn't ever classify people. People classify themselves. And they can do whatever they think is appropriate in those categories. And I didn't point this out, but in the race category, people are allowed to mark more than one race. That was a change implemented in the late 1990s in the federal statistical system. And so since they can mark more than one race category, there's a couple of different ways that the data is tabulated or reported. One of the ways is called race alone. So if a person only marked one race, let's say black, they would be included in black alone category. If someone marked 2 categories, say black and white, they would be included in the race alone or in combination. So it includes everyone who marked black, regardless of what else they marked. A third very unique way of, or not unique isn't the right word, little used categories is when you look at specific combinations of race, like someone who marked white, black, and Asian. And just out of curiosity, there's about 1,000 people in the 2020 census that marked all 6 race categories in the census. But you can imagine lots of different combinations here, and that's the data that's put out in the redistricting data that was just put out in August by the Census Bureau. It allows people to combine different race combinations however they see fit. So a couple different ways of reporting race. And then, of course, since Hispanic origin and race are different concepts, you can look at race for all people, including those in Hispanic origin, or you can look at race distribution only for the non-Hispanic people. And that's often used because if you look at non-Hispanic by race and then add in Hispanic, you get 100% of the population. So it's more convenient for tabulating percentages and stuff. So, so there's a bunch of different ways that race and Hispanic origin can be tabulated and presented. If you go to the next slide, I'll go through a few of those. Excuse me, I'm not used to talking at long periods of time. So this is 4 different figures for the Black population in the 2020 census. These are actual figures. So if you look at only the people who marked Black in no other category, there was 41.1 million. If you looked at the non-Hispanic people who marked Black alone, there's 39.9 million of those. If you looked at people who marked Black alone or Black in with some other group like Black and white or Black or Asian or Black or some other race, the total is 46.6 million. And if you look at non-Hispanic Black alone or in combination, it's 44.3 million. So the point here is there's lots of different ways in which this data can be tabulated and analyzed. And one implication of this, I guess, the drawing is you can imagine when people are doing redistricting and trying to get the best population for their point of view, and they have choices on how to, what data to use, what tabulations to use. They often use different tabulations depending on their point of view, and it makes it more difficult for courts to figure out what's the best answer. So the point here is that there are many different ways of 2 points. One is that Hispanic origin and race are 2 different concepts. And secondly, there's lots of different ways in which data on race and Hispanic origin can be reported. So let's move on from there. Next slide, I'm sorry. Let's talk about the 20.
There's a question. I don't know if you want to take it now,
Sure.
But it's kind of like on the topic of where you just were. It is prior to the 2020 census, the race question didn't ask for national origin. Why did this change?
Well, I don't know if it's national origin, it's affiliation. You mean like the subgroups like Cuban and Chinese? They did ask those in the past. They've changed the race section a little bit. Actually, the race question has changed in every census since 1790. So I don't think what they did on that respect in 2020 is different than what they did in 2010. They may have added some detail to it, but not the broad content. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So let me go to the census operations. That April 1st, 2020 was Census Day, and the concept the Census Bureau used is usual place of residence. So the idea of the census is to count everybody where their usual place of residence was on April 1st, 2020. And those boundaries about usual residence, and particularly the day, Census Day, make things a little more complicated than they might be otherwise. So in mid-March of 2020, the Census Bureau started sending out letters to almost all the households in the country, inviting them to participate in the 2020 census. 80% of those letters that were sent out were called Internet First by the Census Bureau. And it was a letter that had a unique code for that address, one they had to use to fill out the census self-response. And there were no paper questionnaires with those 80%. People were pushed, I guess is the way I used to use the internet. For 20% of the households, they called it Internet Choice, where there was a code, a unique code like the 80% first, but also included a paper questionnaire because they were worried that a lot of those households in that 20% would not be able or would not respond by internet. They wanted to get the paper question out to them first. So those mid-March, all that went out to almost all the households in the country. Between mid-March and the end of April, there were 5 more letters from the Census Bureau reminding them to respond and ultimately sending out questionnaires that had not responded. And so by the end of April, most of the people who were going to self-respond in this manner did so. After the self-response rate was over, or the push was over, Then enumerators were hired by the Census Bureau and sent out to the households that did not self-respond. I'll go through some details on those two things in the next slide, I think it is. Well, this is a little different. So there's two kinds of places people live, or the Bureau, let's put it this way, the Bureau separates where people live into two kinds of units. One are called housing units. Those are the ones first listed there, houses, apartments, condos, so on. There's probably a couple of ones that I can think of, tents maybe. So those are kind of where usually a individual or a small family or a family lives, small number of people were often related. The second unit of residents is they called group quarters. That's where there's large numbers, usually large numbers of people who are not related to each other, like college dormitories and prisons and military barracks and nursing homes. So each of those, the data was collected somewhat differently, but the pandemic infected both of those. And I'm going to walk through that a little bit in the next slide or two. Go to the next slide, please. So to go back to the spring of 2020, you may remember that the pandemic really kind of hit the end of March, and the Census Bureau was getting ready to send enumerators out by the end of April when the self-response phase was largely over. Because of the pandemic, they had to postpone sending out those enumerators. Ultimately, they didn't go out till end of July or early August. And even then, there were some restrictions on where they could go, and they had to have the professional equipment and so on. So that was a big issue. A second way the pandemic influenced the 2020 census, which I don't think has been given as much attention as it deserves. In the 2020 census, I've been watching census since 1970 is my first one that I kind of paid attention to. And there's no doubt in my mind that the 2020 census, in the 2020 census, stakeholder groups, civil rights groups, and state government and big cities and lots of groups got involved in trying to get a more accurate count of the census. Many of them were planning to have events around the April 1st census date where they would do community fairs or other kinds of meetings where what are often referred to as trusted voices, like local elected officials or community leaders or doctors or people that were trusted by the local community, would show up and encourage people to respond. Well, because of the pandemic, none of those could occur. And so there was a big opportunity lost there because of the pandemic in terms of getting promoting the census, particularly in hard to count communities. And then later in the pandemic, as the enumerators went out to households, you can imagine a lot of people didn't want to open the door to anybody, or certainly an unknown person. And so there was a lot of resistance to enumerators getting access to people in households to get responses to the census. And then the last point here is that a lot of colleges and nursing homes had closed down by the time the Census Bureau was planning to, had plans to go get the data from those institutions. And so there was a big impact on the pandemic that the Census Bureau had to try and overcome. And to a large extent, I think they did. Ultimately, the exact quality of the census is still up for grabs, but in many ways, I think the Bureau did a great job of adjusting to the pandemic situation. Next slide, please. Okay, let me kind of walk through how people got included in the 2020 census data. And as I do this, or before I do this, I just want to mention a term that I'm going to come back to a little bit. It's called operational metrics. And it kind of are measurements of how the census was conducted. And these things I'm going through here now are example of operational metrics. There's others too, but that's a term that you may hear, I guess, people talk about, that are measurements of how the census was conducted, and has some overlays, I guess, in census quality that I'll mention briefly as we go through this. So 65% of the households in the country responded to the initial questionnaire, most of them by the internet, about 10% by paper questionnaire, and a couple percent by telephone. So almost 2/3 of the household self-responded. And as an aside, the data that is collected from households that self-respond is by and large better than any of the other ways the Census Bureau gets data. So the higher the self-response rate, the better, more accurate the data. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, this is a national self-response rate. So there are places in the country where the self-response rate is much lower and other places where it's much higher. And the places where the self-response rate is higher are generally thought to have higher quality data. So what about the 35% that didn't self-respond? The Bureau calls this the non-response follow-up, or NRFU is the acronym they use, non-response follow-up. And as you can see here, there's 35% of the population went into the non-response follow-up universe. So as enumerators were sent out to the households that didn't self-respond, about 11% of the households got included in the census because somebody in the household responded to that census enumerator coming out to their household. If enumerator couldn't find anybody at the household, or they wouldn't respond, the Bureau instructed them to try and find a neighbor or a landlord or a building manager or somebody who could act as a proxy respondent for that household, that they hopefully know something about the number of people and their characteristics in that household. 18% of households were included in the census on this proxy response. And you can imagine, easily imagine, I think, that the quality of data one gets from a proxy response is not nearly as good as the quality of data one gets from a self-response. And so neighborhoods or areas that have a high level of proxy response probably have a low level of census data quality. Excuse me. If going on here, administrative records, if the Bureau doesn't get a response from any of the things above, then we'll use what they call administrative records, which is a set of data the government has already collected, like IRS tax records and Social Security and Medicare and some other big files like that. And for more than 20 years, the Bureau has been ingesting these, I think is the word they use, these files and putting them together, trying to build an administrative record database that they could use to help understand who lived in the country. And so in this case, if they couldn't get a proxy response or a self-response or non-response follow-up, they would use the administrative records to estimate or put in the number of people and their characteristics in a household. Then finally, ultimately, this idea of statistical imputation, that if none of the others works, they're not sure if there's anybody lives in that household or how many or anything else, the Bureau has a statistical estimation mechanism they use to estimate the number of people and the characteristics in the household. It's somewhat complicated, but to give you a quick example, if a household that they can't get any data on is in a block where, let's say, 90% of the households are Asian Americans, then they'll probably put that household in as an Asian American household. If most of the households are two-people households, they'll put in two people in that household. So it's not totally random, but it's not as good of data as some of the early responses. So collectively, that's how all the people get into the census. Let's move to the next category. So for group quarters, and I talked earlier, so nursing homes, prisons, college dormitories, records are sometimes submitted by the group quarter facility. As you can imagine, a prison, the administrator will send in records of the number of people there and their demographic characteristics. In some places, Census Bureau enumerators are allowed to go in and collect data, like a nursing home, for example. And in some places, the facility workers will actually distribute the questionnaire, collect them, and give them back to the census. So there's a couple of different ways in which data are collected from group quarters. Next slide. There's a couple of big concerns about the group quarter population in the 2020 census, and given this audience, college towns might resonate as one of the most important ones. So as you probably know, many times students leave campus in late April or early May and go home for the summer. And so the Bureau has typically sent in enumerators in April to these college towns to try and get responses to the off-campus population before they leave. Well, with the pandemic that came in basically late March or April of 2020, well, first of all, the students left by April 1st, many of them, and their enumerators were not allowed to go into it on. They couldn't go out for a couple more months. So there's a lot of concern that students, particularly those living off campus in college towns, might not get enumerated accurately. And the college towns, and a lot of them, as you probably know better than I do, in many college towns, the college population is a big part of the community population. So that's one potential issue. The second one has to do with nursing homes, where in many cases, because of COVID, no one, including the Census Bureau enumerators, were allowed access into the nursing home. And in a number of other ones, nursing homes shut down after April 1st. So April 1st, the census date, there were people living there, but by the time the Census Bureau could get around to access them, they were closed and there was no one to give them any information. So that's another issue about the quality of data on group quarters in 2020. Let me keep going. Okay. So I'll talk about some of the key findings. And I said earlier, a couple of points. I want to emphasize this point a couple of times, I guess, that it's really the small data and small group data from the census that's important. So these are national trends, but all of these are slightly different in states and localities. One of the big issues that came out, this is really not new because we've been tracking this pretty regularly, but there was the increase in the total US population between 2010 and 2020 was 7%. That's the lowest rate of increase since the Depression decade of the 1930s. So population growth is slowing down. Another part of that story is in the bullet below, where slowing down is a product of a decline in the white population of 2.6%, but big increases in Hispanics and Asians, and particularly big increases in some other race category or two or more race categories. And particularly those last two categories, I think, are reflective of some of the diversity that is going on in the country. And the whole part of this, I think, makes the whole population much more diverse than it ever has been, and certainly more than it was a generation or two ago. One other tagline I want as this bottom one here, and one of my focus is on children, particularly young children, but the number of children in the 2020 census was about 1.5 million lower than the 2010 census. This is not a surprise to demographers because the birth rate's been going down pretty regularly. But the fact there are fewer children means there are fewer workers going to enter the workforce in 15 or 20 years. And I think there's a number of implications both for children and for the broader society in the fact that the number of children are declining. So let's go on to the next slide. I'm not going to really go through this, but it's the distribution of the population by race and Hispanic origin, along the lines that I earlier talked about. I'm not going to go through the data, but I wanted to kind of show you what it shows, and hopefully these slides will be shared later so you can go through it at a later point in time. Let's go to the next slide. One of the issues rose when the first data from the Census Bureau was released last April with state data, is that the reapportionment numbers were not what some people expected, or some places expected. For example, Texas expected 3 new congressional seats, but they only got 2. Florida expected 2, but they only got 1. Arizona expected 1, but they didn't get any. And I think one of the things that you can see easily in this is those are states that have large Hispanic populations. And so that it raised a conjecture that there was a high net undercount of Hispanics in the 2020 census. And that's consistent with some of the administration's efforts to add a citizenship question or say some disparaging thing about the immigrant population and discourage them from participating in the census. The bottom 3 says where those seats went. They're pretty, I don't know what to make about that, except those where the seats went. Next slide. Okay, let me talk about measuring census accuracy. Next slide. I mentioned earlier operational metrics, and that has become a much bigger issue in this census than it has been in the past. And the Bureau has provided a lot of data on different operational metrics that have been analyzed by different folks. And it's what's I'm trying to say here? It's suggestive of quality, but it's not the same as measuring quality or accuracy. So I'm going to focus on the last part of this, 2 measures of what I'll call accuracy. One is called census coverage. Coverage is used to reflect both net undercounts and net overcounts. And the second concept or term is omissions. And net undercounts may sound like the same thing as omissions, but it's not. So go to the next slide, please. And before I get to the distinction, I want to reiterate, I guess, this point that these national measures of large groups of on census quality are really not so important. It's the disaggregation and differential quality that's important, often reflected in differential undercounts. So I think it's important to remind ourselves that these large national measures really don't tell us what we need to know. And then the second point here is highlights a mismatch, I guess is the word to use, that, as I said earlier, I think small area data is the most important data from the decennial census, but we don't have any measures of accuracy for small areas. And so there's the data that's most important is data that we don't have good measures of accuracy for. Next slide. I'm going to tell you a word about differential privacy, and I have to tell you, I hesitated to do this because it's kind of new term, and I don't know if we were all together, I'd ask for a show of hands to see how many people have heard of this before I spent time on it. But it is a term that has gotten a fair amount of attention on the census in this cycle, and I will say a few words about it so you have a little sense, I guess, of what it is. And as I said, it's the first time it's been used in the census. And what is the problem? The problem basically is a fundamental one with any data collection, but particularly a census, is that there are two missions. One is to present the most detailed, accurate data that they can, and the other is to protect respondent confidentiality. And those are at odds to some extent. So, the Bureau could ultimately tell you how many people live in each household, but that would obviously compromise confidentiality of respondents. And so the Bureau has dealt with this in the past in other ways, but in 2020, it became more of a concern for many people. And the Bureau employed this method called differential privacy to address it. This next point is going to be a vast oversimplification, but let me try and explain it this way. So differential privacy basically changes the census response with random numbers. So if a block was reported to have 10 adults and 5 children, the differential privacy might change it to 12 adults and 3 children or something else like that. And so by changing the responses that people gave, it protects them from being re-identified in the census. It also makes the census data much less accurate at small levels. In fact, that's the last point there, I guess, is that differential privacy has big impact for small areas and small groups, particularly census blocks. And I'll give you one example of that from my work, that because of differential privacy, there are about 150,000 census blocks where there are children age 0 to 17, but no adults, nobody over age 18. Now, a few of those might be reasonable at juvenile facilities or a 17-year-old married with a 2-year-old or something, but 150,000 of them is certainly unrealistic, and that's a product of differential privacy. I think one of the questions that's emerged out of this is how important is block level data for people and for governments? What's it used for? So I'm going to keep going from there. Next slide. There's two methods the Census Bureau uses to gauge the accuracy. One is called demographic analysis, which compares the census counts to expected numbers based on births, deaths, and net migration. The Bureau has this ongoing accounting that they keep track of how many people are here based on births, deaths, and net migration. The second method is called the post-enumeration survey, or PES. And that method compares the census counts to the results of a second survey conducted very soon after the census in a sample of places. And the post-enumeration survey is particularly important, not only because it provides net coverage like DA does, but it also provides components of coverage, in particular omissions. It's the only source where we can get data on omissions. Next slide. As I said earlier, net undercount is not the same as people missed. The net undercount is a balance between population missed and population counted twice. So if you have more people counted twice than missed, you have a overcount. If you have more people missed than counted twice, you have a net undercount. So it's that balance is what the net undercount reflects. And you can easily understand, I guess, you could have 10 million people missed and 10 million people double counted, and it looks like there's no errors. So it's not the best indication of census quality, but it's the most widely used one because it's relatively easily available and has been used for a long time. The people missed in census are called omissions, and that comes from the post-enumeration survey. Next slide. I'm going to skip this because I think I already went through it and I'm a little bit pressed for time, I think. Okay. As I said, the demographic analysis compares the census counts to expected population based on this, and it's available by age, by sex, and somewhat by race and Hispanic origin. The limitations on race and Hispanic origin are limited at the bottom there, where the only two race categories that are available are Black and non-Black. And that's because historically, birth and death certificates, that's the only race category they coded consistently. Hispanics, data for Hispanics are only available under age 30 because it wasn't until 1990, 30 years ago, that Hispanics birth certificates in particular started coding Hispanics regularly. Next slide. Okay. As I said, the post-enumeration survey is conducted right after the census is completed. The records from the second survey are compared to the census record to see who was missed and who was counted twice. There is some data for states and large counties, but given the fact that it's a sample, that data is typically not very useful, not very accurate. And as I said earlier, it's the only source of omissions. So it's an important addition to our understanding of quality. Next slide. This is a comparison from 2010 of the DA coverage rates and the PES coverage rates. And I'll draw your attention to the youngest children, where there was a undercount of 4.6% in 2010 compared to 0.7% in the PES. So there's a big difference there, a somewhat big difference for age 5 to 9. But for the rest of the groups there, the differences are not that big. The PES and DA are relatively similar for all groups except young children. So either one you use for coverage is probably okay. Next slide. So let me talk about two different ways to look at the accuracy based on the 2010 data. There were a little over 16 million, what the Census Bureau calls erroneous enumerations. These are basically people counted twice, or people who are included who shouldn't have been, like a child born after April 1st, or someone who died before April 1st, who somehow got included in the census. There's this other issue called imputations that I'm not going to take the time to talk about now, but a little over 16 million of those. There's just a little under, back up please, 15.999 million omissions. If you subtract the omissions from the erroneous enumerations, 36,000 difference. That's pretty good by census quality standards historically and internationally. It looks like a very good census when there's only a difference of 36,000. On the other hand, if you look at those first two rows, erroneous enumerations and omissions as different kinds of errors, and I think they are, and certainly in statistical terms, then there was 32 million errors in the census, a little over 10%, give you a very different view of the quality of the census. And so my point is that be careful about exactly what you're being told about quality and make sure that you understand the distinction between net undercounts and omissions. Next slide. This is just a slide that shows the difference between net coverage rates and omission rates in the 2010 census. My only point here is that you can get very different perspectives on the situation depending on whether you're looking at coverage rates or omission rates. And in general, omission rates are much higher than net coverage rates. And that kind of makes sense given how they're calculated. But I want to underscore here, I guess, the difference. Next slide. This shows the 2020 net undercount rate of minus 0.3% related to earlier census. As you can see, it's relatively good compared to other censuses. It's a little worse than 2010 and a little worse than 2000, but in general, the overall net coverage rate in the 2020 census is not bad by most, certainly by historical standards. Next slide. These are some of the undercount rates that we've been able to calculate so far based on the 2020 census and DA. That middle column is the one that shows the 2020 data. The first column is 2010 data. I'll draw your attention to the fourth figure down there, minus 4.4, which is the net undercount for Hispanic children age 0 to 17, which is twice as high as it was in 2010. And I'll note that actually earlier today, some data was released from the National Academy of Science that shows for Black children, same age period, it's also a very high net undercount of 4 or 5%, which makes me concerned about the quality of the census for more vulnerable groups. I think those two groups kind of are called tip of the iceberg is not quite the right, but I think they reflect the experiences that more marginal or vulnerable groups probably had in the census, and they don't bode well for differential undercounts or differential accuracy. Next slide. Let me just talk a little bit about the data that has come out or is coming out, so you have a sense of when to expect things. I mentioned that the apportionment data for seats in Congress came out in April of 2021. The redistricting data came out last month. The next two files that will come out are called demographic profiles and the demographic and housing characteristics. Those will be the first kind of detailed data we get on 5-year age groups and so on. And so that will be really important, but it probably won't be available until late 2022, a year from now, or maybe even more than a year from now. Then after that comes out, there'll be something called the detailed demographic and housing characteristics file that has even more detail from the 2020 census, but that won't be available until 2023. So next slide, and I'm about done here. Here's what I hope you take away from this. One is that the decennial census is a very large and complex undertaking, and it's very important for the system of government we have. I also hope you remember or note that the most important census data are small area data. And I think it's clear, should be clear that the 2020 census was really complicated by the COVID pandemic. And even though it probably required some adjustments, the Bureau did pretty good making those adjustments. What I take away from the initial data of the 2020 census is that the accuracy is a little bit worse than 2010. It may be a lot worse. I think we're still waiting for the final picture on that. And I think that what I mean by a lot worse is the differential quality is going to be much different, much brighter in 2020 than it was in 2010. I think the marginalized groups, the hard to count groups, the historically undercounted groups are likely to have worse quality census data in 2020 than they had in 2010. And I guess I'm kind of underscoring this last point here, that the real important measure is differential accuracy, not total accuracy. Next slide. Okay, this is me. Thank you for listening. And if you want, there's my email. If you want to follow up, I'm happy to respond to any questions you might have. I think there were some questions in the chat, but I didn't have a chance to look at them.
I think we can summarize those for you, Bill. Did you want me to do that, Bree-Day?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So we got another question on race ethnicity. Why are race and ethnicity questions not combined in the census, since race already allows combinations in other kinds of surveys?
It's a good question. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer except political history. And let me tell you, this is not quite on target, but it may help answer that question. So, the Census Bureau has been aware of some of these problems for a long time, of particularly of Hispanics marking some other race and people being confused about the racial categories, not seeing themselves in these categories presented by the census. And starting in 2010, they did a bunch of experiments asking people race and ethnicity in different ways. In 2017, fall of 2017, the Census Bureau proposed to the Office of Management Budget a new way to ask race and ethnicity that had a number of changes. The two key ones were they added Hispanic as a race category, and people could mark as many categories as they want. And people seem to understand that better than the current way of asking. They also were proposing to add a category called Mideast North Africa, MENA, that people from that area of the world have been asking for a while, and as well. So you can imagine, I'm told a lot of people from that part of the world don't see themselves in any of the current categories. So adding that category would help them self-identify better. So that was proposed in the fall of 17, the Office of Management Budget. The Office of Management Budget didn't act on it at all. They kind of ignored it. And so the Census Bureau had to take a test census in the spring of 2018. And they got to the point where they couldn't wait any longer to print up forms for that test census. So they had to use the old method that was used in 2010. And that became why they used that same method in 2020. But I think many of us are hopeful that that issue will be revisited and that OMB will allow the Census Bureau and other groups to ask ask race and ethnicity in a way that gets more high quality responses, if I'm saying that accurately. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. There was a question about non-response. You had noted that administrative data sources are used to fill in the blanks for count when households aren't providing answers. Can they help with, obviously they're helping with the overall count, but do they help with other characteristics of those people when records are used?
Yeah, actually, but there's two. The biggest, to follow up what the example you started, that when they don't get any information from a household, they do both the count and the characteristics of people in that household from the administrative records. So, and I should back up, I guess, and say the term the Bureau is using is high quality administrative records. And what they mean by that is the data from the data is the same across 2 or 3 different administrative records. So you're pretty confident that this is a 30-year-old white male because that shows up as a 30-year-old white male in 2 or 3 different sessions. So they typically used high quality administrative records. So they do use it both for the number of people in the household and their characteristics.
Thank you. The slide where you talked about population growth. Somebody had a question asking about the 2.6% white decline. I think it was a decline.
Yes.
Was that a white only statistic?
I think so. I'd have to go back and look, but there's the reference there is there's a paper by a guy named William Fry, F-R-E-Y, actually, University of Michigan demographer, formerly there, but now works at Brookings Institution. He wrote a paper in the last month from Brookings that has that data in it.
Yeah, thank you. A reminder to those of you, we're getting close to the end of the questions that have been asked so far. If you still have questions, please do enter them. We do have 4 more minutes. But we do have another question about errors. Between the 32 million plus errors and the errors resulting from differential privacy, it appears that this most recent census in the US is not very reliable. Is this a fair conclusion?
You know, it's first of all, it's a continuum. Very reliable is a tough term to really use. And I think part of it, and it depends on the use. For large areas like states and big counties and metropolitan areas and big groups, I think it's probably pretty good. When you get down to census blocks or other very small areas, I think the error is suspect. One of the things we don't know is how suspect it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago for census blocks, for example. There's always been some error in the census, but it's been largely ignored. I do think there's more error in those small areas now because of differential privacy, but how much more and how impactful that is a bit of an open question. And as I said, it kind of depends on your use, whether it's reliable enough or not.
Thank you. One more question about the controversy over citizenship. Just looking for your comments on how immigration status is or is not dealt with in the 2020 census, given that the administration was not, the former administration was not allowed to add that question.
Well, there's 2 things. Citizenship and immigration status are 2 different things. There's a number of immigrants who are not citizens and they're here legally. So as I said, immigration status was not asked on the census, but as your questioner points out, the administration, and particularly by trying to add a question on citizenship and surrounded by the comments they had made about those groups, raised a lot of concern in that population about responding to the census. And I think that was the point, that they tried to discourage immigrants, particularly as, well, I wouldn't say particularly, but Hispanics are the bulk of the immigrants, from responding to the census. I think it had some impact. There's a couple of different surveys that have been done to assess that, and it's somewhat mixed results. And so I don't think it's as quite as pervasive as some people think it is, but I do think it had an impact on the number of Hispanics who responded and responded completely and honestly. So I think we'll see, we'll have more information on that when we get more data from the census in terms of details of location, but I think it did have an impact. If you want more information on it, there's a group called NALEO, National Association of Latino Elected Officials, NALEO, that has kept a close eye on that, have a lot of papers on that, and is probably the #1 source for the impact of that citizenship question on Hispanics in the census.
I will read you one last question, asking about whether imputation or privacy adjustments impact only the small area data, or does it even impact the reapportionment data?
It doesn't affect the reapportionment data, which is only state level. They did not do, in fact, I think the law does not allow them to do anything with the state level data that are used reapportionment. But even for bigger areas like Wayne County, Michigan comes to mind, where it's what, 1 million people or so, that it has very little impact for something that size. It's only when you get down to places of 10 or 20 or less than 50 people. In fact, I think the Census Bureau did some analysis. When you get over 200 or 300 people in a unit, differential privacy has relatively little impact.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bill, for your talk today and for being a good sport and answering all these questions. We learned a lot, and thank you and to the participants that joined us today in this webinar. This will be posted on YouTube and the link shared with those of you who have registered. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.